Hello everyone, GoldenNova here. Today, I'm bringing you a video requested by one of my Quasar commanders over on the Patreon. Now, normally they ask for a particular archetype to be explained, but not this time. We are still focusing on a theme, but not in its usual format. Archfiends have shown up on cards since the very beginning of the game, even as far back as Summoned Skull, though because of translation foibles, you wouldn't know it at the time. And they aren't contained to just a single archetype. You can find Archfiends everywhere, from scraps to infernities. You can even find them as fairies. Yeah, Archfiends don't even have to be fiends. They can be beasts, psychics, and even dragons. It's a name that's so pervasive and saturated that even if it does crop up on a card, you can't really mark it down as part of one team or another. It would be as ridiculous as doing the same thing for words like warrior or of. But that brings up a bit of a head scratcher. Sure, they aren't part of the same archetype, but some do share design philosophies across this broad category. So today, instead of explaining what each card does, we're going to take a peek at each one, find out what their role is, and see how they fit into the broader picture so I can explain to you what an Archfiend deck even is. Let's get started. Okay, not quite yet. Before we go any further, any discussion about Archfiends wouldn't be complete without spotlighting the premier Archfiend architect, the Archfiend guy. Yeah, that's his real name, and he's dedicated his Yu-Gi-Oh journey to learning the ins and outs of the topic of this very video. So if you want more in-depth information about Archfiends in general, or any specific subset of them, I highly recommend giving him a watch to drink of his vast well of knowledge. Okay, so our first step in this process is figuring out what doesn't count for today's video. And the first ones off the list are the chess Archfiends. That's right, all the Pandemonium related monsters are not being considered here. Why? Well, we're talking about cards that aren't part of an archetype, and the chess Archfiends very much have a consistent series of effects and a thematic through line, so we actually can't include them here. I'm also dropping any Archfiend that's already part of another archetype's roster, because their allegiances have already been decided for, and we can't count on them to bring about the glorious Archfiend revolution. This cuts out things like Black Skull Dragon and Black Skull Dragon substitutes, any number of Red Dragon Archfiends, and the nefarious Archfiend Eater of Nefariousness, plus their upgraded possessed form. We can keep the normal monster version though, that's just a little squirrel beast. Also, it amuses me. With our spring cleaning taken care of, that leaves us with roughly 40 cards that are just Archfiend support. So now that that foundation has been cleared, let's take a look at our building blocks. First, we have our normal monsters, Archfiend's Mirror and Soldier, as well as that Archfiend Marmot of Nefariousness. Mirror isn't anything to write home about stat-wise, but being level 2 could be useful. The same could be said for Marmot, but is a bit better because level 2 Earth Beast is itself a pseudo-archetype all its own. So now you can weave some Archfiend nonsense into those decks as well, if you're so inclined. On the opposite end, Archfiend Soldier has great stats for a level 4 monster, and both can be summoned by unexpected die, giving us a way to deploy them without using our normal summon, giving us free materials for whatever we want. But unless we find some sprite synergies, I think it's safe to say we're all in on Soldier for this, if we even play it at all. There's also Beast of Talwar to consider, which is a big 1 tribute vanilla that is almost immediately outshone by Summoned Skull by a 100-point margin. Thankfully though, there's a great home for this card, and it's in my deck over on Scarlon's Commander Prog series. He is my husband, and I will hear no slander against him. Archfiend Eccentric is the only pendulum monster we'll be talking about today, but that shouldn't take away from its impressive utility. Put it in the scales to make it a mystical space typhoon, or if you need monster removal, you can spend your normal summon honor to do an exiled force impression. The only issue is that we won't be able to recover Eccentric by normal means because it's going right back to the face-up extra deck, so it has no problem swinging into action, it just only has the spoons to do it once. Archfiend Eris is where things get funky because we're looking at a kind of Stratos for everything we're about to talk about. If destroyed by battle or sent to the grave by any card effect, you can add any Archfiend card, except a copy of herself, from your deck to your hand. Now, sadly, this means it's not as simple as normal summoning Tour Guide, grabbing Eris and linking it off, but the good news is that it's as simple as normal summoning Tour Guide, grabbing Fiendish Rhino Warrior, and linking it off to send Eris to graveyard with Rhino's effect, giving us a surprisingly positive amount of consistency. See, this is the kind of stuff you can get when you stop goofing around with all those pendulums and take your royal duties seriously. Shadow Tamer may not seem like it fits the bill, but there are a lot of Archfiend cards that didn't get translated correctly when they came to the States, and Tamer is one of them. But it's not too much skin off my nose because the effect isn't that good. A flip that steals an opponent's fiend until the end of the turn is slow, situational, and has a ton of answers now, so I think it's better to just forget this oddly warrior-typed monster and leave it be. Besides, you never know when the Fire Emblem lawyers are going to show up, and Shadow Tamer's looking a bit too much like Erica from Sacred Stones for my liking. Archfiend Cavalry, like Soldier, has a really good attack stat for its level, and it's not doing much more than Soldier while on the field. But the real power is when it gets destroyed by a card effect, because then you get to revive any Archfiend from your grave. It can't attack, but will likely have some other utility you can take advantage of, so we'll want to keep an eye out for cards that destroy your own, something Fiends are pretty capable of. Cyber Archfiend is... well, it has nothing to do with anything we're trying to accomplish here. It's an extra draw during the draw phase if our hand is empty at the time, but blows itself up if we have any cards in our hand during the end phase. I was equally baffled at it when we covered it during the Big Zane Explained video, but to be fair, Cyber is about as strange a pseudo-archetype as Archfiend, so these two are kind of peas in a pod. Oh, speaking of cards we've already talked about, Jack Atlas loves Archfiend monsters. We aren't going to be going into the Red Dragon variety because, once again, that has its own episode with a dedicated playstyle surrounding it, but the same can't be said for a number of Jack's free agent monsters. Mad Archfiend has a decent attack stat and does piercing battle damage, but gets beaten up by everything because it goes to defense position whenever anyone around it raises their voice, even a little. Lancer Archfiend is a bit smaller, but gives other monsters piercing, and Archfiend Interceptor is like an attack punisher, burning your opponent for 500 damage every time they do so, as long as this running back is in attack position. They don't really do anything for the theme as we understand it though, so they can just stay in their respective videos. Best not to set them up for failure or anything. Skilled Red Magician isn't an Archfiend, but it does summon an Archfiend from the hand, deck, or grave if you tribute it after it has accumulated enough spell counters. It's tempting to lump this alongside the Summoned Skull cards, as the Skilled Magician line is a series of spellcasters that help to summon out many of Yu-Gi-Moto's favorite monsters, but because this works on all Archfiends, we're taking it. Just gotta play a bunch of spell cards to make this work, and spoilers, we aren't exactly making room for Endymion, so our work is kinda cut out for us. Trance Archfiend was a pretty nifty tech pick for Dark Worlds, at least back in the day when their options for discarding effects were limited. It gave you an outlet for all their effects while getting you back any of your banished dark monsters on destruction. A 2000 attack normal summon isn't something to turn our noses up at, but currently we don't have as good a place to put this card as Dark World does. Honestly, the strangest thing going on here is that Trance Archfiend is, by dint of holding Gen X ally Birdman, dual terminal cannon. Can't wait for this connection to spiral out of control. Lesser Fiend is just like a level 5 monster. It banishes whatever it destroys in battle, so that's cool. Most floaters around that time needed to go to the grave to trigger their effects, so this helps to get around those, but isn't much stronger than powerful level 4 monsters, and a little boost could close the gap in a jiffy. It's also a component for the fusion monster Fiend Skull Dragon, also an Archfiend in our collection, but it's arguably even worse. This one only negates the effects of flip effect monsters, as well as any trap effects that target it. Tribute monsters were already a pain in the neck back in the day, with very few giving any actual good payouts, but going around and calling this one a lesser fiend, like, that's just cold, come on. Mist Archfiend is a card with an interesting bit of history. The ability to normal summon this for a 2400 body can help break up a lot of defensive lineups, which is a welcome sight, but does come with the very serious drawback of blowing itself up and dealing you 1000 points of damage. But stun decks bypass this altogether using Skill Drain. Sure, you're still losing 1000 life points, but this time it's because you're spending it on a floodgate that's doing work for you, as opposed to your monster exploding in your face. The question is, does this work well as part of an Archfiend deck? And the answer may surprise you. For now, let's keep this combo in mind. No need to worry about FOMO here, which in this case is the fear of misting out. Archfiend Commander is really cool because you can summon it for free as long as you control an Archfiend card, but you do have to destroy an Archfiend card if you summon it that way. Oh no, if only we had monsters that synergized with being blown up. It's also got another mode where if you tribute summon it, you get another level 6 Archfiend from your graveyard, and considering the stat line here, this is basically a summoned skull with a little spice on it. But thankfully, we have good targets outside of it to use as well. But something of note to consider is that the effect that destroys an Archfiend on summon is a separate effect from the one that summons it from the hand, which means we have another positive skill drain interaction. I'm telling you, they can put all the fancy modern effect trappings on the monsters as they want. They still very clearly yearn for the vanilla. However, I suppose this also inescapably ties us with the Summoned Skull cards. I wanted to avoid them, seeing as they, like the chess Archfiends, have their own internal focus, but they mostly keep to the extra deck, so they make for fine tech picks if nothing else. And it lets you use Yugioh the Magical Mist, which is a weird kind of Raigeki that you can also use in Thunder decks because reasons. The basic idea is that Summoned Skull has a Ritual, Fusion, Synchro, and Xyz counterparts that are all treated to summon Skull on the field, but are still Archfiend cards. They all provide some kind of continuous effect that benefits your Summoned Skulls, except for the Ritual, which just protects itself from being destroyed by battle or monster effects, except if by a Ritual monster source. Manifestation, the Fusion, gives all of your Summoned Skulls a 500 attack boost. The Synchro, Call, prevents your opponent from targeting your Summoned Skulls with card effects. And Ascent, the Xyz, can detach a material to prevent the destruction of any number of your Summoned Skulls by battle or card effect. They also all have an effect where, if sent to the grave by an opponent's card after being properly summoned, special summons a Summoned Skull from your hand, deck, or grave. Sadly, because our extra deck monsters only count as Summoned Skull while on the field, they can't float into each other, so you'll just have to be content with getting the original body back onto the board. For our general Archfiend deck, these are a fine inclusion, with Commander getting back a level 6 body on Tribute Summon, making Ascent is pretty easy, and a fusion spell from Manifestation gets you a 3000 attack monster. The one I'm most concerned about making though is Call. Because all these Summoned Skull regional forms have these same stats, type, attribute, and most importantly, level, we can't actually make Call using a Summoned Skull. And we haven't run into a good tuner yet either. So if you want to avoid the hassle altogether, I certainly wouldn't say that's a bad call. Archfiend Giant is a bit of an odd duck. It's got a once while phase up on the field effect that keeps it safe from effect destruction, but costs 500 life points to use. But if destroyed by a card effect, it allows you to special summon an Archfiend monster from your hand. If you can get this out for free, it's a pretty cool monster to attack with and can help deploy more threats from your hand to replace itself, but it's not currently my first option. Also, I just got a good look at this for the first time. Is this thing crawling into a coffin to grab you? If so, that's very Dark Souls of it. I love this aesthetic. Archfiend of Gilfer is funny because the effect to equip to a monster triggers if sent to the grave from anywhere. Now normally with stuff like this it has to be sent from the field first, so this is a pretty exciting development. Granted, I wouldn't be excited for it a few months ago, it doesn't really do anything aside from a 500 point debuff, but now Foolish Burial is all you need to access Necroquip Princess. Yeah, you send Gilfer to grave and equip it to any of your fiends, because it doesn't say you have to equip it to an opponent's monster. And now you have a little bonus effect that draws you a card or equips a discarded monster for more attack, making that card a reverse Archfiend of Gilfer. Talk about your fun bulk discoveries, and this is all thanks to Fiendsmiths. Thank you, Fiendsmith. You've definitely done nothing wrong to this game ever. Berserk Archfiend is a very reasoned addition to the team. It's kind of like Commander, where summoning it involves destroying your own cards, though in this case you have to destroy up to 2 monsters you control, including a fiend. But by doing this, you get to absorb the original attack of target monsters your opponent controls, with the number of targets being equal to the number of monsters you destroyed to summon this in the first place. So if you pop one of your monsters, Berserk Archfiend has an Honest attached. Destroy 2, and you get to Honest 2 different monsters before you even attack. Not only can we trigger cards like Cavalry and Eris this way, this can also crack a board wide open while dealing some serious damage. And when it's all over, well, it's a level 6 monster, and the rank 6 pool is still pretty good. Not to mention that this guy has great taste in manga, that's always a huge plus. Archfiend Emperor, the first Lord of Horror, is a big mamma jamma and isn't afraid to own it. It seems pretty similar to Mist Archfiend, heck we even get to keep our full attack and defense spread under skill drain, but negating effects won't keep Emperor from blowing itself up, because that is a condition that is sadly applied during the act of normal summoning it without a tribute, not a triggered mandatory effect like Mist Archfiend, so no way around that. Still, you're looking at potentially 3,000 attack and some removal if you land this without the negation. And nothing's stopping you from using an effect to special summon this, because it has no restriction on its own summons. It just keeps you fiend locked while it's active because it hates to party with anyone outside of its very curated social circle. Oh, and something I learned thanks to being on Motos You Don't Know Jank, this card is censored. The TCG version removed the red button from its crotch because, well, for fear of losing monetization, I'll leave it up to you why the TCG wouldn't want that there. You'll figure it out, just, use your head. Archfiend Empress has seen some major improvements over its younger forms, and this is what you get when you apply yourself, folks. Keep this in mind. It lets you save a different Dark Fiend on your field from being destroyed by banishing a Dark Fiend from your graveyard instead, but only if it's just the one monster. And it protects from battle and card destruction, so that is quite nice. And when this card is destroyed and sent from the field to the grave, you can special summon a level 6 or higher Dark Fiend monster from your graveyard except a copy of this card. So even when toppled from their throne, Empress ensures someone comes along to take care of things in her stead. Actually pretty forward thinking of her, and is probably the best argument for running Giant that we've seen so far, helping to get Empress onto the field from the hand so this fiendish royalty can do her duty. But can we please get her like 100 more attack points? Only being 2,900 at her station feels wrong. Annihilator Archfiend is like a repeatable Berserk Archfiend. Sadly, the pops don't summon it from hand, so you're gonna have to find a way to get this onto the board by itself. But what you're getting for that is a Scrap Dragon that gains attack for the turn based on any Fiend monster's attack that you destroy. And this checks for both yours and your opponent's. So if your opponent is running Fiends for some reason, you can steal a little extra attack and then go to town. But level 9 is a very awkward one to work with. It doesn't let you overlay into anything nifty, especially for Fiend locked under Emperor, so the only thing that can salvage this is some kind of level 1 tuner to unlock level 10 synchros. But we're gonna have to look off theme for that if we want to utilize it. So while you go looking for that, I'm gonna go see if I can find out why Annihilator is wearing a golden temple on its hat. Is Eldritch grabbing a ride on this thing or what? I mean, I know the Cursed Eldland was having some tourist problems, but taking it to them, that's pretty radical. That covers all the main deck monsters that I want to sort through. Let's take a look at our extra deck offerings. Scrap Archfiend is a level 7 synchro, and I know I said I was overlooking archetypal monsters, but we're looking at a non-effect monster here. If anything, it does more for us than it realistically does for scraps. Chaos King Archfiend is a bit more contentious though. It's also 7 and is part of Jack's roster, but otherwise is just a weird utility synchro that messes with battle stats. I think we can keep it. But then we have the hilariously named Chaos Archfiend, which is an entirely different card than Chaos King Archfiend. This one is more difficult to use since we need a light tuner, and even though Archfiends are basically all dark attributes, Fabled have a fair few amount of tuners that can help bridge this gap. And if you can manage to make this, you've got one hell of a monster on your hand. Potentially a 4,500 multi-attacker that banishes what it destroys in battle and floats into another Chaos Synchro monster when your opponent removes it. If anything is worth the effort, I think this is. Thought Ruler Archfiend is an old level 8 synchro that's very much fallen out of favor, but it's a less picky level 8 than Chaos Archfiend. On top of that, you get targeting protection and gets you back some life points, which is pretty nifty. It's certainly a lot more useful than Overmind Archfiend, which is entirely psychic from its effects all the way down to the material requirements, so it's not worth talking about at all here. Master King Archfiend is another dip into an established theme, but I would argue that while this is just a retrained Terror King Archfiend as part of the chesses, Master King is generic Fiend support. It also works with any of our life point paying cards, filling our grave with many a Fiend before immediately shuffling them off somewhere else. Usually they'll go back to the deck, but we have a 1 in 3 chance to either add the Fiend to the hand or special summon it. And for an effect that triggers for free as many times per turn as we can get Fiends into the graveyard, it's not half bad. The next 2 links aren't really fiendish though. Both are Cyber's type, with Vector Scare providing some strange monster stealing or multi-attacking at the cost of tributing some monsters, and Linkmail Archfiend is meant to synergize with special monster card types. I think my favorite part is that while its attack reduction and destruction protection effect works with rituals, fusions, synchros, and Xyz, it only prevents the targeting of your monster's special summoned from the extra deck, so unless your ritual is also a pendulum, they just get left behind, which I think is rather rude. Honestly, these are more SMT style demons than the ones that we commonly use. Moving on over to the spells and traps, a deal with Dark Ruler is very situationally useful, so I understand why it's not in proper rotation, but I'd argue it's even easier to use it now because you only have to send a level 8 monster you control to the graveyard, and links exist. For your trouble, you get a 3500 attack monster that attacks all of your opponent's monsters, and the only downside is that it loses 500 attack during each of your end phases. That means you get a whole other turn where it's a 3000 multi-attacker. Just saying, you get to play with Skull Greymon, how can you pass that up? Archfiend's Oath has seen some niche play in a lot of different themes that happen to do a lot of stacking. Archfiends proper do not have this capability, so it's basically just an Archfiend card that stays on your field that occasionally draws you a card, so that's cool. Acts of Despair is an old school equip card, and buddy, that extra 1000 attack puts in work. You wouldn't make a lot of use of that recycling effect, but it's nice that it was there. However, its latest retrain, Archfiend Staff of Despair, is a huge improvement. It doesn't boost the attack of one of your monsters, it reduces all of the opponent's monsters' attack by half of the equipped monsters. So you can absolutely dismantle an established setup. And when it goes to grave, you just have to pay 1000 life points to put it back into your hand, which is a much better alternative than tributing a monster to put an axe on top of your deck. But the card I'm most excited to talk about is Falling Down. It's basically a snatch steal that only works if you have an Archfiend card on your field, and instead of your opponent gaining 1000 life points every standby phase, you lose 800 life points. Now, this is less exciting as Snatch Steal has slowly removed itself from the ban list, but hey, quiet, stop ruining my enjoyment of this incredibly niche equip spell with your facts, gosh darn it! Archfiend Palabyrinth is our Pandemonium replacement, and it's not half bad. A 500 point attack buff to all of our fiends turns our Archfiends into brutal legends. And, as a bonus, you have a way to take a fiend on your field and trade it in for another Archfiend from your hand, deck, or graveyard of the same level as one you control. The only issue is that you need another Archfiend on board to provide that level to determine what you can summon. But because of this, even if it makes our monsters a little easier to summon, because our matching leveled Archfiends are a little limited, not to mention we need fuel for the effect, it's not the most elegant solution to building a board. Honestly, I prefer the other Labyrinth, but I get it. I'm gold, they're lesbians, it just wouldn't work out. Archfiend's Ghastly Glitch seems like an easy card to cut because it's got the Labyrinth crew on it, but this is just good fiend support in general. It's not as plug and play as cards like Compulse are, you do need a fiend to activate this, but it pops any card you want and sends a fiend from your deck to the grave. And like we talked about earlier, sending Fiendish Rhino Warrior to grave to trigger Eris grabs you any Archfiend card. Or you can just send Eris from deck to graveyard to get any Archfiend card. It's not a must in every deck, but in one such as ours that's desperate for playables, this is high on the list. Though I'd like for this to be less of a feature and more of a bug, I do love these glitches going around. Archfiend's Roar has got to be one of the worst pieces of archetypal revival around. Like, you're supposed to be rewarded for playing on theme, but now you have to pay life points, and you can't use it as tribute fodder, and you lose it at the end of the turn? The only saving grace here is that this destroys the Archfiend, so you get to make up for the lost card if you summoned back Trance, Giant, Eris, or Empress. That's a lot of bending over backwards to make this card work when we could just play back to the front for an even better result. And also, if we skip this, we don't get yelled at, which honestly, I can't really deal with, so I'm happy to move on. Nightmare Archfiends is more of a stun tool than one that helps Archfiends, so I'd skip it for now, but I'd be remiss if I didn't take this time to mention that this is a key card in a new FTK. Earthbound Release blows up the opponent's monster lineup and burns them for damage equal to all of the destroyed monster's attacks. So if you give your opponent 3 Nightmare Archfiend tokens, that's 6000 damage across 3 2000 point bodies. And if that wasn't enough, each one deals 800 damage to its controller when destroyed, which will be another 2400 damage. So all you need is a monster to tribute for Nightmare, Nightmare itself, and an Earthbound Release and Transaction Rollback in your grave. Fill up the opponent's field with big tokens, then use Rollback to force the effect through even though you don't meet the activation requirements. It's actually really goofy, and any deck that enjoys a fair amount of normal trap cards can run this as an all too easy to use win condition, and there is no quicker way to get people at your locals to shun you than this, so it's got a bit of real world utility to it too. Simul Archfiends is another card that's got the name but doesn't have much to do with fiends or destroying cards or really anything. It's more of a card meant to punish players that focus on one, or maybe two, monster card types, specifically ones that summon the same type more than once, while benefiting players that run a wide variety of these. Magic-Key Spirit Vapartu is on the art to show off one of the few themes in this game that can pull something like that off. Vapartu is itself an Xyz, but the gun it's holding could be a ritual, as those tend to be some kind of firearm in that theme. And the giant bird is reminiscent of the theme's fusion monsters, even though it is another card in the theme we've never seen before. Hey, quick tangent, there are a bunch of themes in Yu-Gi-Oh! That have small stories that just don't get resolved, and Magic-Key is one of them. So seeing a card in that world with so many unexplained elements and no follow-through is intensely frustrating. Give me more lore! Call of the Archfiend may look like your standard Call of the Haunted knockoff, but instead of being tied to a single monster, this can repeatedly summon a fiend monster every turn as long as you have the fuel for it. Sadly, we can only summon level 5 or higher fiends with this, so most of our lower leveled starter cards are off the table, but we still have a ridiculous amount of good targets. Like what we find in the card. The first Lord of Horror is a 3000 attack beatstick with removal. Empress gives protection and a floating effect, and it's probably the best way to put Annihilator onto the board. So if this is the kind of deck you're looking to make, it's absolutely as necessary as it gets. Just remember to keep some change on hand whenever you use it. It is going to be a collect call. Okay, that's every relevant Archfiend card, so now we have to answer the question that we all came here for. What exactly is an Archfiend deck? What does it seek to accomplish? And what are its win conditions? Well, there's actually a lot of familiar infrastructure here. We've seen fiends that destroy their own cards, benefit from being destroyed, and have a strong level 6 presence. But if you've been around the game long enough, you know that I actually just described a big function of modern Unchained builds. The distinction between them and Archfiends, though, is how often we're presented with summon locks. I mean, you could trip under any card in the Unchained list and find yourself in a fiend lock, but Archfiends really only have that when the first Lord of Horror is on the board, and if that's a problem, you can just link it away into the various nightmare monsters, which also provide you with some great utility, leaving the door open to combo with any number of other cards. For instance, you could splash in some Chaoses if you put in a few light monsters as fuel. Ghost Ogre and Effect Veiler make for great hand traps after all. You get a broader pool of rank 6 monsters to choose from, and a lot more eclectic effects from cards like Archfiend's Staff of Despair. So the game plan has a lot of similarities to Unchained, but Archfiends lean a lot more into their tech cards than a more focused archetype might. This pretty much relegates them to the realm of jank until a real archetype comes along to whip them into shape, but does make the possibility space to work with them infinitely more fun. Okay, now that we have all of our infernal ducks in a row, how do we build a deck around them? The first part is figuring out their commonalities and building to their strengths. Thankfully, they do a good job of communicating this to us already. I mean, their fiends, their dark attribute, it's basically written on the tin. There aren't many good tuners that we could use with them, at least on theme, so we can really skip over synchros. But on top of having a few good level 4 monsters, our level 6 pool is surprisingly broad, so Xyz and Link monsters are going to be our two best friends. Especially Xyz, because Konami took my request and made sure not to ban Wave High King Caesar on the latest ban list so we could use it for this video. Unfortunately, they did take away my wife Beatrice, so there goes a ton of our graveyard access. That being said, the rank 6 pool is still stuffed with great options. Wolo, founder of the Drudge Dragons, can provide a huge attack boost to your board and does a lot to mess with your opponent's grave. Utopia Beyond is a bit bright for our surroundings, but does zero out the attack of all of our opponent's monsters, which is sick. Dampier Vampire Sheridan is removal and stealing all in one, while Constellar Ptolemy M7 just puts monsters into the hand, either from yours or your opponent's field or grave. And while Evolzar Lars isn't quite as good without Dino and Reptile material, it is still kind of an Omni-Negate, so that's nifty going first. Throwing cards into the grave is going to be a recurring motif among the cards we use, so we'll want as many ways to summon those monsters back to the field as possible. Call of the Archfiend goes a long way towards helping with that, but a little extra help from cards like Monster Reborn wouldn't go amiss. I'm also a big fan of running Doomdog Octoros. It's another great summon target off of Tour Guide, and if you link it off instead of using it as Xyz material, we gain access to all of our level 8 fiends. And by all of them I mean Archfiend Emperor and Empress, which are themselves both Archfiends, so why would we even bother running the Doomdog? Well, because there are other level 8 fiends out there, you silly Billy. For instance, Diabolica, the Draconic General. It's a free summon from hand or grave if another fiend is sent to the grave by a card effect, and if Diabolica is sent to the grave by a card effect, you get a fiend from your graveyard back into your hand. If you want to mess with your opponent's grave a bit, Fiend Griefing is where it's at. It basically works like Archfiend's Ghastly Glitch, except instead of popping a card, you shuffle a card from your opponent's grave back into their deck. And bonus, you don't need to control a fiend to use it. And while they're not fiends, when you need level 6 monsters, it's hard to get much better than the Bestials. At the very least, they do still fit our spooky aesthetic and helps bolster our hand trap lineup. Incorporating the summoned Skull fusion is going to be a bit rough, especially because we don't have any dedicated fusion spells to help us out here. True, we have Fiend fusion spells, a Dark Fusion is an evil hero focused one that gives the monster we summon targeting protection for the turn, and Dark World Accession can fusion summon any Fiend monster at quick speed while banishing the material from our graveyard. However, neither of those options felt as good as what we can accomplish by running regular old Polymerization, alongside a couple copies of King of the Swamp. They'll act as extra summoned skulls in case we can't find the original, and by playing regular Polymerization, we get a little bonus out of Guardian Chimera. Slottable into almost any fusion deck, Chimera will provide a great chunk of battle stats, removal, and card draw, all while putting more fiends into the grave. I thought about running the new Chimera fusion engine since it loves working with fiends, but I find the fusion lock to be prohibitively restrictive considering the rest of our pool. And because we're playing one TCG exclusive in the form of Necroquip Princess, we might as well toss in Area Leader to give us more Polymerization targets. It's also another Foolish Burial, and can summon itself from the grave by banishing our bigger fiends. As a funny little tech pick just for me, I wanted to include that 6. Most of the Master King Archfiend die rolls will put the fiend sent to the graveyard back into the deck, but I want to keep him, and this card does just that, turning all of our odd rolls into 6s and all of our even rolls into 1s. This way, we either get the fiend into our hand or we special summon it. And get this, that 6 is an optional replacement. You can choose to change the roll. So if for whatever reason you want the fiend to go back into the deck and you rolled a 2 through 6, you can still opt to let it happen. Or if you roll the option that adds it to the hand but you want to special summon it instead, that 6 will flip the number so that you can do that. It's kind of funny. Oh, and speaking of making the most of Master King, this is something I picked up from watching the Archfiend guy. Second plug, go follow him. Make sure you run Unending Nightmare. It was conceived as an anti-pendulum card, but is still great for clearing out back row. But for our purposes, it represents a ton of searches. See, you pay 1,000 life points every time you use the effect, and Nightmare Archfiend sends a fiend monster from your deck to the graveyard whose attack and defense equal a life point cost that you've paid. And guess what matches 1,000 life points? Archfiend Eris's attack. So you send it with Master King Archfiend, get the search, and no matter how the dice roll goes after that, you'll be recycling it to trigger the effect again later. The same can be said for Farfa, Malebranch of the Burning Abyss, because it also has 1,000 attack, giving you a way to temporarily banish a monster as needed. And with that, I've talked about everything that I know about Archfiends. It's absolutely wild how this pseudo-theme has morphed and changed over the quarter-century history of the game. From being a general label for demons of all sorts to having found an identity among the fiendish pantheon, Archfiends are here to stay. And I'm curious to see if, like how Goblin Bikers folded in every random goblin card to ever exist, that we'll see something similar with Archfiends, bringing together this court of cantankerous curs and forging them into the strongest legion the underworld has ever seen. Or they can just keep lounging around as pack chaff. Honestly, showing up for a card or two every couple of core sets seems like a pretty sweet gig actually. I wonder how I get in on that. But now, I want to hear what you all have to say. What's your favorite Archfiend card, and what's your favorite way to build Archfiend? Do you run a copy or two of any of these in your deck because you like it so much? And if you could make an Archfiend archetype, how would you do it? Answer one or answer all, but no matter what, answer in the comments below, and if you haven't already, please be sure to like the video if you liked it, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and be sure to share this video with somebody that you know who loves Yu-Gi-Oh! It really does a lot to help me out. Today's episode is brought to you by Dragon Shield. Get the sleeves as strong as dragon scales and get 5% off your order by using the coupon code GoldenNova at checkout. It was also brought to you by my lovely patrons, including this month's illustrious Quasar Commanders, Upstairs Media, and the Wizard Moose, Nebula Navigators, 3rd Dynasty, 50 Gigabits, Ada Basilisk, Adam Zajdel, Owexotoa Hime, Anansi Dragon, Ancient Wizard, Andrew Newman, Kane Senpai, Christopher Fuss, Clockswork, Comrade Copperbottom, Eric, Frankie, Garland Chaos, Great Big Pillock, Hairbear, Happy Majin, Harry the Ominous Benefactor, Iron Zero, Iskander 711, Carp, Mana Charge, Marion James E. Picata, Megacombe is entering the Chrysalis, Millennia Asta, Mern, Muse Clark, Nathan Vig, Natiel Lee Alexander, Orozco 09096, Panther J, Pat Poos, Rebel King Lucifer, Red Eyes Jackalow, RJ the Jank Monarch, Serenity Towns, The Critic of Innocence and Thievery Coast, Cosmic Crusaders Beden von Titty Sprinkles, Beelzephyr Fish, Beluga Masta, Blitzwolf, Chaz Ghost, Dr. Reaper RIP, Eva Padilla, Hike Boyagian, Herbal D, Ignis Heat the True Draco Slayer, Inblink, Kale the Dragon, Kevon Public, Lobomaru 02, Manga Pages, Matt Simmons, McSpoofy, Michael Shimabukuro, Mike, Nitromo, Nyx, Obsidian, Shizuka Nijimura, Sophie, apparently, Stephen Williamson, Taylor Seymour, The Legendary Raven, The Phantom Knights of Shitted Pants, The Gene, The Pokemon 52, Tiger X2476, Weasel King of Weaseltown and Zaldureka, as well as all the lovely Starlight Explorers you see on screen now. If you'd like to help me in my journey to cover all of Yu-Gi-Oh's archetypes, get my videos early, be a part of these credits and other awesome perks, it would mean the world to me if you would check out the link to my Patreon in the description or consider joining as a YouTube member. And if you'd like to see more fiendish fancy, check out this video where I cover the Nightmare Monsters. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.